Hello everyone, and thank you for joining Off the Drawing Board, the official Sheffield University Architecture Society podcast. I am Daphne, your host, and I welcome you to the second episode of our architecture book series. Today we have Dennis Karolev, a student of the University of Sheffield, joining us. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
It's great to have you here, and thank you for joining us. Dennis will be talking about one of the most emblematic books of architecture, which is Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large by Koolhaas and Bruce Mau. Dennis had chosen some passages from the book for us to discuss and intrigue you to have a go at it. But first, Dennis, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your architectural journey.
A bit about my architectural journey. So I'm at my last year of education, possibly, I think so. So sixth year Master of Architecture student at University of Sheffield. Before that, I studied in University of Reading, which was also great. I've been interested in postmodern architecture and kind of 70s, 80s architecture for a few years now. And I've chosen a book from that time, SML, XL, Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large.
That's perfect. Thank you for that, Dennis. Now, you were really interested to talk about this book to us. And to introduce this book, as said, the title is Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large by Dutch architect Koolhaas in collaboration with the Canadian designer Bruce Mau. And the book was published in 1995 by Monticelli Press and 010 Publishers. We know that Koolhaas is an important representative of Deconstructivism, and that was actually something that you can see in the design of the book itself, because it is a peculiar amalgamation of text, images, plans, sections, everything. So, Dennis, I have a question for you. Can you explain what this book is about? What is the essence of this book?
To be fair, on the back of the book there is a description, and I could not summarize it better. The first sentence is, this massive book is a novel about architecture, and the book is about architecture. 1,400 pages just about architecture. It doesn't talk about feminism, sustainability. It is a book strictly about architecture. Every single page. Whether it's talking about the theory behind the building, or showing you drawings of that building, or often analyzing cities and sometimes other buildings as well. Or even stuff like client meetings and the experience of making architecture as an architect in the 80s, early 2000s.
So you would say it focuses specifically on that time of architecture, or it gives a more panoramic view?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much a book of its time, which is why someone might see as a shortcoming, but I think it's actually its strongest point is that it's very in that time, and it's mostly focusing on what the world looks like at that time, what it is to be an architect at that time. It never goes back too much to think what it was to be an architect a century ago, or what would be an architect in the future. It's pretty much a book of its time.
That's great to know. And I would like to also ask you, why did you want to talk about this book? So what did you find particularly interesting about the way that this book is written, structured, or explained by the architect?
I wanted to talk about this book because it's a very interesting book. If you're someone that is studying architecture or an architect, it has a lot of very interesting, very useful theories and some of the most important writings of that time. But also, if you're not an architect and you're into, let's say, graphic design, the designer of that book, Bruce Mau, has just done an excellent job with this enormous task of formatting over 1,300 pages. So it's really interesting, and it's just a beautiful book, to be fair. It has this beautiful textured silver letter with different colors. Just a gorgeous piece of book throughout, from the first page to the very last.
The book itself is a statement, really, isn't it? Because you've got Koolhaas, which is, as we said, a representative of Deconstructivism, and you've got that architecture that is really challenging the idea of how a building should be set up and what we actually want to get through with our building, and whether it should respond to certain existing buildings or if we should make something pioneering. So Koolhaas kind of does this with the book itself. So the book has a very specific architecture that I've never seen in a book before. You've got varying scales, you've got collaging. It's got its own peculiar structure. It might have a page that's got one photograph on it, and then you change in text fonts, change the text sizes. There's a really big variety of content in it. So what do you find interesting about that?
I find that the book is really challenging to read, as in, I don't know how to read that book. I recommended it to you prior to the podcast, and I cannot tell you this is how you look at this book. And you kind of need to have a strategy, because it's just a massive piece of work. It's 20 years worth of architecture and thousands of pages. It's just a super awkward experience. That's the best word. It's acute, it's awkward, it's strange. Even the presence of the book is 3 kilograms, it has a substantial weight, and it's just uncomfortable to read it, no matter if you take it with you on the train, if you have it on a coffee table, if you have it on a couch. You're asking yourself, am I doing this the right way? And then if you start reading it, do you go through the book page by page, or do you just pick out a chapter? Or some pages, I found that really interesting. Some pages, you kind of can't even read them, or they don't make sense almost. For example, there would be an architecture drawing, and there would be a text superimposed over it. You can't really see parts of the drawing, but you can't also fully read the text. So it's kind of challenging the reader at all times.
The book is a statement itself, really. It has a very particular way of being presented and being structured. And I think that's really interesting that you brought it in with us, because it's really one of a kind. It is like a journal that Koolhaas has made throughout the years. And you know, when you've got a journal that is messy and it's got scribbles in it and it's got text overlaying, as you said, or it's got smaller and bigger images, smaller and bigger text, different kind of pens. It feels like that. It feels like a really personal journey through that book, and it doesn't really have a linear movement. It's got scales in it, which is something really interesting, as the title itself has to do with scales, but you don't really have a movement, a linear movement of time, of reading, a sequence.
You can probably read it backwards.
It's one of those books, isn't it? There are not many like that.
And you can read it in different ways. I've tried to read it 3 times, and I take on a different strategy. So the first time I just sat with it for over a week and looked at every single page. The second time I kind of just picked out chapters that I wanted to go back through. As you said, it's very eclectic, and kind of the only thing that's consistent and is guiding you through the book is the scales, which is the title of the book. It's a small, medium, large, extra large, and everything in the book is arranged according to that. But other than that, the book never helps you to understand it. There are many instances where a chapter is interrupted by something with no explanation. So you would have 20 pages describing a project, and then the next page is just a scan of a newspaper with some article, and you never understand why is it there. Or a lot of times it's artworks, but you don't even get kind of a reference. You either know the artwork or you don't.
You're kind of in Koolhaas' head and trying to understand what the train of thought is, but thoughts don't really have a logical sequence all the time. And that's really nice to be reflected on the book.
I think a lot of these drawings and stuff that he's referencing is actually something that inspired him. Or, for example, there is a chapter in the book about a building in Japan. So it was part of this complex where I think Arata Suzaki invited a few architects, and Koolhaas was one of them, to kind of design buildings as part of a cluster. And he spends a few pages writing about what is it to have a meeting with Japanese clients. He says, we go in this meeting, it's like hours long meeting, super dry, super boring, and it keeps jumping between super tiny details and then super large scale overall things. And it seems like at some point he adopted this, or he resonated with it, because that's what the book does. Sometimes it would talk really seriously and in a very kind of dry, analytical way about a very important topic. But sometimes it's super poetic or playful. Like there is a comics in the book about developers and how they kind of torture architects. And he is constantly jumping between these things. Or in kind of the same chapter or the same part of the book, he also spends some time analyzing Japanese pornography. And he doesn't explain to you that this is something that informed architecture, but you kind of start to pick up from looking at his project that he is interested in how do you reveal parts of the building, how do you different transparencies within the building, different types of glass. And that's something actually when you visit his buildings, there is a lot of materials that are transparent or semi-transparent, or a glass that's curved and it's distorting stuff behind it. And he's kind of trying to show you without being too literal where that might be coming from.
So he kind of is reflecting on his own work, but also his own journey through architecture and how he's experienced it through the years, isn't he?
So his father was a writer, I think, and Rem Koolhaas also has a background in journalism. And at some point he transitioned to architecture. And he's kind of very open about that. He's someone that's fascinated in architecture, and throughout the book he keeps kind of reflecting not only on the world but on his buildings. There are these moments where he might be critical of his own work or be open about struggling with a facade or being behind on a project. But that's just his experience, and you get that sense that, yeah, you're in the head of this architect who is figuring out how to be an architect. He is really good, but he's also taking you kind of with him in a very eclectic way.
And in order to understand that experience of Koolhaas and how he thought about everything, or what his journey in architecture was, because this is a really big book, and as you said, it's really difficult to wrap your mind around it, you've given me 3 passages to discuss that you thought are representative of this book and will help us explore the ideas that Koolhaas is presenting and how he implements them in this book. So the 3 passages you've given me vary in scale and in content. The first passage talks about the Architecture Museum in the Netherlands, and then we've got a chapter that pragmatizes Atlanta City and its development and how it currently stands as a city, or as the epitome of deconstructing a city, of the end of the city itself, the end of urban life. And lastly, we've got the idea of the typical plan, which is a surging idea in the architectural world of making the plan as simple as possible, having rectangular spaces as our inhabiting or working spaces, which is kind of becoming quite more prominent, mostly in America and transitioning to other parts of the world. I would like to invite you to introduce the passages to us, starting from the first passage for the Architecture Museum.
Yeah, well, I tried to... The only way to fully perceive the book is to fully perceive the book. But I spent a lot of time thinking how to introduce people to that book, including you. That's why I picked a variety of different chapters. So the first one, which is about Kunstbau 2, the second Kunstbau, and we'll briefly mention the first one. It's very good in showing you how creative the book can be, talking about an idea, and how it uses graphic design and images to convey that. So the Kunstbau 1 and 2, the first one was never built, so it was a project that apparently the clients just didn't like, and now if you go to Rotterdam, there's another building, quite nice actually. But then later they got a chance to build, so the first one was the Architecture Museum. Later they were invited to do the Kunstbau 2, which is a small art gallery kind of next to a boulevard. The interesting thing with these 2 projects is that we already mentioned that context is a big topic for Rem Koolhaas, and he kind of responded to a context, but not only the physical context of the building as in the surroundings. He also responded to that context of the project in his overall body of work and the chronology of the practice. So the first Kunstbau was this triangular building with a square orthogonal internal organization and with this column grid. And then once they didn't build that as kind of like a joke or a play or just continuing the theme, they inversed it for the second Kunstbau, which is in Rotterdam. And it's square in plan, but then all the internal organization is kind of skewed and non-orthogonal.
It has this peculiar structure to the plan itself, doesn't it? It's kind of triangular, but not even an isosceles. It's a very peculiar triangle.
It has this tunnel cutting through the middle of the building as well. And another thing that's interesting, and that's kind of a theme throughout the work of OMA, is that the plan is not just these stacked planes, but they're always kind of interlocked and linking into each other. Yeah, on the first page of that chapter, it's asking how do you come up with a plan like that with a square building, but it's kind of infinite, it's just looping around, it's a spiral. And the way they talk about that, well, they don't talk about it, but the way they represent that in the book is very interesting. So the whole chapter of Kunstbau 2 is this photographs of the building. And as you're going through the pages, there is this very peculiar text superimposed, so it's like a sentence on every page. And the text makes absolutely no sense. I remember the first time I read it, it just doesn't make sense. It's this, what am I doing here? Do you remember what you had for breakfast? Type of text. But actually that text is from Samuel Beckett's book Waiting for Godot, which is obviously a play on, I think, Waiting for Godot. I've never actually read the book, I just know a little bit that it's this absurdist book where 2 people are waiting for a third person, Godot, and nothing ever happens. And they just keep talking, but they keep losing track of their thoughts, and it's like this this very abstract, nonsensical conversation. And by superimposing that on top of the sequence of the promenade of the building, I think what Rem Koolhaas and Bruce Mau are trying to ask is what's kind of the meaning of the journey through the building. Does it have to have a meaning? Does it have to start and end anywhere? And does it have to have this grand moment of arrival and then you remember the building in a certain way? And when you visit the building, it's actually, there is nothing kind of remarkable about it. All the facades are slightly different, but there's no facade that would kind of stand out to anyone that's not really into architecture. But then throughout the building, there are these interesting spaces. They're all slightly different. They have different materiality and different details, which are exciting. So that's mostly what I think about the first chapter. And I think it's good because it kind of introduces you a little bit to the architecture, the buildings of OMA.
I think it also mentions a lot about void and solid space, which, as you said, Koolhaas loves to play with transparencies. So that is kind of represented even in the pages. There is 2 pages where it just has an exploded view. The structure in the windows, I think, the open and closed spaces of that building. So would you say it's quite representative of Koolhaas and OMA ideas of architecture?
Yeah, you've picked up that's a big theme of the book, and their work is what's there and what's not there. And also going back to the pornography thing, is certain way of censorship is literally cutting out, like having these black shapes over something that you want to censor. There's pages in the book where you have censored pornography. And projects like, I think, Paris Library, which never happened, and it's all about cutting voids out of the building, having these spaces that are massive mezzanines and atriums in different shapes cutting through the building. And even when they were modeling that and making concepts for it, it was as much about the model that they cast as much it is about the cast and the form that it was casted in.
It is a big challenge of how you experience that building, how you create that building as an architect, and what you want the people to get out of it. So I think an interesting question would be if somebody who is an architect and somebody who is not an architect would experience it in the same way, and if they would notice the very specifics. So for instance, when you enter the art gallery, would you get the same things out of it as an architect, where you notice the textures, you notice the very specific details, and would you experience it differently if you weren't an architect?
I think so. I think especially with Kunsthaus, you would probably not take that much from the building, and that's the beauty of it, because it intentionally takes you back to where you started. That's what Waiting Godot is for, like, doesn't start anywhere and doesn't get anywhere. And that's intentional. But maybe other buildings like Casa da Música in Portugal, it's kind of doing the same thing, but also it's a building of a different scale. It has these more memorable spaces, these massive carved out atriums. And I assume that's actually a building that people in Portugal, from what I know, seem to like. It's probably more memorable.
It has to do a lot with the context as well that you've mentioned about Koolhaas using as a manifesto for his architecture, both in the example in Portugal and the Architecture Museum. You've got a very specific sense of context or no context.
I've seen some people criticize OMA for that, saying, again, with the project in Portugal, it's not responding to the context. But at some point in the book, Rem Koolhaas I think it's a chapter on bigness, maybe, I'm not sure. He's asking the question, how do we respond to such context, to the context of the contemporary city? Maybe we shouldn't. That's just, again, he's looking at these cities that have changed so much in the 20th century that they've become something entirely else. And he probably himself is not sure, how do you respond to that context? We have buildings that are pieces of infrastructure, buildings that are so big that they constitute entire parts of the city, and can you always respond to this context? And should you? Another thing is, he's this architect that's practicing internationally. Obviously, not only him, his colleagues as well, we should give them credit. They make buildings all over the world, and it's that question of how can you respond to a context which is not your context. So they do buildings in Holland, and they probably quite familiar with contractors there, with the building techniques there. But then when you go somewhere else in, I don't know, in America or in Asia, you're a foreigner, and what do you do then?
This is a fascinating question and a really good introduction to what this book is about and how we are being presented to this sense of scale. So this is mostly talk about one specific building, and it's an existing building as well. I think that links quite well to expanding this scale and expanding this context and landing to Atlanta City, which is the second passage that you've given me. So this passage is actually a manifesto of what Atlanta City currently is and what elements it's got or what it presents us, how you experience it. But then it quickly changes to expressing how Atlanta is really a very flat structure, that it does not comply with the conventional existence of a city of having the main downtown and then expanding to the suburbs and the surrounding things that happen around it. But it kind of has a flat way of expressing itself, that everything is happening everywhere. So it's kind of rethinking that sense of city. It's kind of the end of the city as we know it.
Yeah, I've picked Atlanta, and the book does that on a few other instances. It looks at European and also cities in Asia and Atlanta. And also Koolhaas, before writing Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, he wrote Delirious New York, which is an observation on New York in the 90s. And that's the question of the large and extra large from the title. That essay is towards the end of the book. And it's about the megalomania of architecture. It's this industry that has grown so much exponentially over the course of a few decades that it's changed everything. And the cities that we know that have a downtown, that have these contexts, that's not what's happening in Atlanta. Atlanta is this place with skyscrapers and all these massive highways and motorways connecting everything. And even when you're in Atlanta, you probably don't experience the city as you would experience walking through a European city, because you simply can't walk there. And then you have all these modern construction, which is typical for America. You have these skyscrapers, these concrete and steel buildings which have become so big that they no longer can respond to the context. That's what Koolhaas says. Yeah, they start competing with each other. It's all about what's the biggest building, and the downtown disappears. There's no longer that sense of this is the heart of the city. Everywhere is nowhere, and everywhere is also the same and somewhere.
I think it's good to question whether we want that in a city, because the existence of a hierarchy in spatial arrangement within the city, so having the center where all the activity, all the heart and life of the people that live in it was quite essential since the organization of the ancient polis in ancient Greece up to now, that we see European cities are pretty much still based on that. And probably cities in America as well. There are cities that are exemplary of this. But Atlanta shows how this kind of is falling apart. So we've got this centrifugal development. So even though we do have a space, there's actually the same importance in every space.
Or the same lack of importance.
I think that's maybe a better way of explaining it, because if you don't have one way of expressing importance, so for instance, the importance of center, and then the less important suburbs or the less important developments around it, then how do you define importance? If you don't have anything important, you don't have any importance in the city.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can't really define it, and that's, I think, the power of the book is that it spoke about these things and it attempted to reflect on them, because it's very easy to look at these kind of what today we call liminal space and just criticize it and say, okay, I'm gonna just focus on making houses in the countryside and more rural projects. But actually the book tries to understand what's going on and somehow respond to it and criticize it, but also question maybe there is liberty in that non-space, in that uniformity across the globe. It also, this chapter feeds really well into other chapters of the book, like the typical plan, which we're gonna mention, or one of the first projects, which is Koolhaas' thesis project, The Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, which is this hypothetical project of London being divided in two, and then there's this building in the middle where everyone wants to be, and essentially it's like a voluntary prison. And what's this delirious architecture that no one wants to leave? And it's kind of relevant even today. We are prisoners of architecture. That's what Atlanta is. I imagine when you're in Atlanta surrounded by these glass skyscrapers that have absolutely no sense of detail and human scale, there's nowhere to walk, there's all these highways, you're not really in a city, you're in architecture, you're a voluntary prisoner. And it also reflects on what's going on inside these buildings. You can't open the windows, the light is always uniform, this terrible super bright white light with the suspended ceilings every office building has.
I think that links quite well to the third passage that you've given me, because it kind of is compromised by all those elements. So this is the typical plan. You have made a little introduction to it. So the typical plan is something that is predominantly present in America right now and mostly in office developments. But it is this simplification and this complete disregard of needing spatial qualities. So you've got rectilinear, simple plans to make up your whole life. So what can you tell us about this?
I think the typical plan originates from America, as you mentioned. In the chapter, Koolhaas talks about the European plan and American plan, which is more on the typical side of it. But unfortunately, that's the problem of the typical plan, is that it's typical. It's everywhere now. You have typical plans here in Sheffield. You have them, a lot of them in London. You probably have them at the most obscure places in the world. It's just the result of that world that we live in that is obsessed with constantly growing and like this psychopathic need to control reality, and everything is measured and it's all about growing the GDP, and people work 9 to 5, you control time. The climatic conditions within these buildings are perfectly controlled. It's like always the same temperature, always the same light, always the same amount of time, always the same amount of productivity, or even better if it's growing. And the typical plan is just this phenomenon that seems to take over the world. It's even probably more relevant, that chapter today, than it was when it was written. And it's also, as an architect, when you look at that plan, you kind of, what do you see? It's, Koolhaas writes, it's not a place to eat and to kind of exist. It's just a place. Any actual function or human need is always pushed to the center of the building or to the side, and then priority is given of that abstract, endless, empty space where business unfolds. And also, that chapter shows you really well how Koolhaas positions himself. So he spends all of these words and pages seemingly criticizing the typical plan, and then he briefly shows you a concept for a project for a bank in think Amsterdam, and he says, okay, that's how typical plan, how European plan, and it just makes you question why. I thought that you disagreed with it.
Yeah, this is really weird, because Koolhaas has this sentence that quite struck me when I was reading the passage. So the typical plan is not a space to eat, to make love, to sleep. It is a place to be, and it actually quite challenges what it is to be. So are we just entities in that space? And he seems quite criticizing of the typical plan, but now you're telling me that he puts another point of view in that. So what if the typical plan prevailed? So giving us an example of it existing, it shows us quite realistically how it is to have a typical plan.
Yeah, he questions what if there's freedom in the typical city, in the typical plan. I don't think he's vouching for it and openly fully supporting it, but I imagine it's probably just acknowledging that that's the world that we live in. And as an architect, if you're not contributing to these typical spaces, what do you do?
It is quite stressful for an architect to think that, because the typical plan essentially means the death of architecture and the death of spatial differentiation. We will all be living, existing, working, functioning in the same spaces. It doesn't really matter how the space is organized or what you put in it, because we're going to have, at the end of the day, the same lights, the same windows, the same chairs, the same furniture, and it will be arranged in the same way, kind of like industrializing humanity and the way we experience our day-to-day life, because the building, whether we want to admit it or not, plays a massive part of our lives. The built environment is how we live, how we survive, and how we live well as well.
Yeah, I would argue that the typical plan and the typical buildings are typical for a reason, as the same way when you need to sustain kind of a population on these industrial scales, and like one corporation produces all the food and everything, it has to be typical for a reason. So in these buildings you have the typical ceiling, which is super efficient. It just works for kind of acoustic reasons, for it just efficient, it's cheap, it's easy to draw, easy to install. Yep, it's the same as having these endless fields of monocultures outside the city. It's when it's that question of scale. When you reach the extra large scale of building, it gets really hard to make something unique. And that's probably what OMA does, in my opinion. They have these projects that, like the Seattle Library, it's one of the world's biggest libraries, but it's actually quite memorable and interesting. But it's also a building of that same time, same scale. It exists in the same realm as these other buildings that they talk about.
It's really interesting to see or to try to imagine how this will develop in the future and how things are going to be organized, spatially in our cities, in our buildings, in our ideas as architects, viewing all the ways that scales will be arranged in the future.
Yeah, especially with the typical plan, a lot of offices after COVID seem to be struggling a little bit. Maybe, I don't know, maybe technology has kind of liberated us from being voluntary prisoners of architecture. It's allowed us to kind of exist in parallel with the typical plan and also in our homes, which are, I would hope, not typical.
This is a powerful statement, and I think it's a nice quote to wrap up our conversation about this book. This conversation has actually been really interesting, and I would really like to thank you, Dennis, for recommending this book and offering to come and talk to us about it. I think everybody will really benefit from it.
Thank you for having me, and I hope you will also, and the audience, I hope someone finds interest in that book the same way I did a few years ago when someone actually introduced me to the typical plan.
I think I will definitely be exploring it more, and hopefully our listeners will also be going to the library to find this book. It is available in Western Bank and Information Commons for everybody who wants to have a look at it. And remember that if you also have a book that you would be interested in talking to us about and has to do with the field of architecture and are a part of Sheffield University School of Architecture and Landscape, you can talk to us about it. If you contact us in any of our social media, we will be able to arrange a podcast with you about a book that particularly intrigued you. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you at the next episode.